All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Ed Recker, and I'm with Sallie Mae. Bear with me just a moment as I get everything pulled up here. As a just a quick kind of public service announcement. Unfortunately, I will not be able to share my camera or go on camera, I should say, this afternoon due to some connectivity issues. We woke up this morning and we had no internet, so I'm working off of my hotspot. Have no fear though. We do have our presentation today, which is how America pays for college. And we're also going to be going over some of the FAFSA, uh, new things with the FAFSA. So again, thank you so much for joining us. My name's Ed Recker, and I'm going to jump right in here. So just a little bit about the webinar. So we're going to cover a handful of topics here. We're going to cover college planning and decision making, and AI. I don't feel like we can talk about anything anymore without talking about AI. We're going to do kind of a post-mortem, if you will, on how families paid for college in academic year 23-24. And we're also going to talk about the old versus new FAFSA. So we do have some good survey data about that as well. Uh, Really, what's in it for you? We're going to try to help you understand what's driving college choice. We're going to uncover pay for college strategies and plans. And then we're also going to do a little bit of an evaluation of the impact of the FAFSA overall to better plan for, well, it says next year, but realistically, we're already there, right? So let's jump on in here. Um, Before we get into the meat of things, I want to talk about the methodology and why it's important because you all have to have a good idea of where this data is coming from. So How America Pays for College turned 17 this year. So a bad election joke is it's about time to start thinking about college and registering to vote, right? But okay, so with that, there is no such thing as good financial aid humor. It's all bad. And joking aside, this research is Sallie Mae's flagship public research report that's based on responses from 2,000 undergraduate students and parents of undergraduate students. So this is current students. The research focuses broadly on students and parents' attitudes towards higher education, how they make their college decisions, and how they pay for it. We partner with Ipsos, so an international data and insights company, to collect the data, and they help us ensure that the results we report are truly representative of college families. So let's talk about college planning and decision making. So as we said, oh, I'm sorry, I think I jumped a slide there. There we go. When we talk about school choice, the factor that's ever present for most families is cost. But as you all know, and as we'll explore in our research, cost isn't the only consideration. In general, 8 in 10 college families said they eliminated a school from consideration based on cost alone at some point between building their long list of schools and deciding which schools to attend. What's interesting is that 61% of students and parents eliminated a school based on cost, even before deciding which schools to research. So here, of course, the question is, what cost information are families using when they're evaluating options early on? Are they looking at cost of attendance, or are they digging deeper to understand the net price? We know from other research that many high school families don't feel confident about the different elements and variations of school costs, and many believe that cost of attendance is what they'll be expected to pay. Because of that, surfacing information about college costs and average aid package is critical to helping families navigate this stage. So as we said, cost isn't the only deciding factor when it comes to choosing a college, although it is a significant one. Here, we ask students and parents to select the factors that went into their school choice decision. The bottom line is that cost, location, and the specific academic program are the top three factors that help most families decide which school the student will attend. These aren't surprising. These factors are answers to the key questions families ask themselves at this stage. Well, what will I study? Where will I live? And how much will I pay? There are secondary factors that also play a role. For example, 23% of students said that friends attending a school played a role in their choice, and another 18% pointed to social life. More practically, a school offering a learning experience that is online or on hybrid schedule was a deciding factor for 19% of families. School size and prestige were mentioned by 15 and 13% of families. So what we found when it comes to ultimate deciding factors, there are some differences in school type as well. Families who choose a two-year school are more likely to consider the financial aspects. So half of the families said they choose their school based on financial considerations, compared to only 35% overall. Then, on the opposite side of the spectrum, families who selected a four-year private school were more likely to report that their ultimate decision was based on academic considerations. So 47% of them said that compared to 39% of families overall. Families who choose a four-year public school are somewhere in the middle. So I mentioned AI in the intro. Now, and that's a topic that it seems like everybody's getting in on and getting excited about. So for the first time, we included questions about the use of AI tools in the college planning, application, and decision-making process. What we learned is that AI is most certainly part of the students' and parents' lives as they embark on their higher education journey. 23% of students and 18% of parents said that they used a Gen AI tool, such as ChatGPT or Gemini, for a range of tasks. The applications are broad, from researching colleges to proofreading essays, researching financial aid to helping decide which school to attend also made the list. So now let's talk about covering education costs for academic year 23-24. So families paid an average of just over $28,000, so $28,409 for academic year 23-24. This number is on par with what we found in our last year's study, just a 1% increase this year. Keeping in mind this number is a composite average, so it may not sound familiar to you. When we break it down by school type, families where the students were attending a two-year public school paid about $15,200 on average. Families with a student at a four-year public school reported paying an average of $24,900, and four-year private school families paid the most, and on average, $43,800. So this past academic year, family income and savings provided by students and parents covered nearly half the reported costs. Parents specifically covered 30% of college spending, the single largest source of funds in the category. 27% of costs were covered by free money from scholarships and grants. 23% was covered by borrowed funds, 12% from students. Relatives and friends covered about 2% of college spending. If we exclude scholarships and grants, so free money and money from relatives, that leaves 71% of college spending being covered by families. Let me say it another way. 71 cents out of every dollar for college spending comes from families. It really quantifies that financial burden that families carry when it comes to paying for college. So talking about some of those elements of how families pay for college, we're going to talk a little bit more about scholarships. So all of our research is a great confirmation of just how important scholarships are. They truly make college happen. 87% of families agreed that earning a scholarship is something to be proud of, and 80% of those who used scholarships believe that scholarships made college possible for them. That is, without scholarship dollars, the students wouldn't be able to attend a school of their choice or they just wouldn't be able to go to college at all. Having said that, significant misconceptions persist. Most significantly, 52% of undergraduate students and parents believe that scholarships are just for those with exceptional skills and abilities. Overall, 64% of families used scholarships to help pay for school in academic year 23-24. As you would expect, the proportion of families who use scholarships and the average amounts of scholarship dollars they report varies by school type. So, for example, just 50% of students at a two-year public school used scholarships, reporting an average amount of about $2,600. 67% of four-year public school students use scholarships with an average amount of about $4,800, and 71% of four-year private school students use scholarships, reporting the highest average of $11,800. All right, so we said 64% of scholarship users said they received the money from their school, reporting the highest average amount of about $8,200. Having said that, the state and companies and nonprofits are also significant sources of money for students. 39% of scholarship users won a scholarship from either of these sources with an average amount of about $2,500. We also asked those students and parents who did not use scholarships last academic year whether they applied for any. What we learned is that the majority, so 64%, didn't even apply. So think about that. Almost two out of three folks that didn't use scholarships didn't even apply. The lack of awareness of any scholarships to apply for is the leading factor preventing more families from taking advantage of free money. Beyond this, families don't think they would win, and others believe it's too hard to apply. So we're going to move on. We've talked about scholarships. Let's talk a little bit, or let's talk more about the FAFSA. And we know that this has been an incredibly hot topic, not only in financial aid, but really across the higher education space this year. Before the FAFSA overhaul, we were seeing some optimistic results when it came to the proportion of families who filed the FAFSA for academic year 23-24. While FAFSA completion rates started decreasing right around when the application window was moved back to the month of October, we saw a stabilization and a slight increase over the past couple years. 74% of families reported that they submitted the FAFSA in 23-24. And I want to make a point of clarification. So this is 23-24. This isn't the FAFSA for this academic year that we're in. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that coming up. But because we do our survey really in March, April timeframe, we didn't have complete data for this current academic year of 24-25. However, we are going to have some basically sneak previews of it. So bear with us. We're going to get to some of that information, but we really want to hit on 23-24 first and foremost. So if 74% of families filed the FAFSA in 23-24, that means 26% did not. The main reason families didn't file the FAFSA, and this reason has been a top one for many years in this research, is that families believe they make too much money to qualify for any aid. 33% of non-filers mention this for a reason. So 1 in 3. Now, it makes sense to me that families making a lot of money have this idea. And in fact, among non-filers making $150,000 or more annually, 63% mention this as a reason. However, 1 in 4 families making less than $100,000 also mention this reason. And this, of course, is a misconception. We know that most families that apply get something. Other reasons for skipping out on the FAFSA are logistical, such as 18% not having the time to file, or 17% not having the required information, or 13% finding the application too complicated. We do hope that although last year was bumpy, this current year was bumpy, we're hoping that as the new FAFSA settles, some of these issues will be addressed. And it probably won't be with next year's survey, but the following year, that we'll really have better line of sight on that. As we know, the FAFSA is a gateway to almost $114 billion in federal aid for higher education. So how did what families receive match their expectations? Well, to start with, 1 in 5 families who filed, so 20%, didn't have any expectations at all when it comes to how much federal aid they would receive. 54% of filers received about the amount they expected. 5% received more than they expected, and 21% received less than they expected. In all, then about 4 in 10 families either didn't know what they would get or got less than they hoped for. So I promised to talk about the new FAFSA, or as the Department of Ed was calling it, the better FAFSA. So here we are. We're gonna talk a little bit about that. Oh goodness. At the time of data collection, about half of our respondents already completed the new FAFSA for academic year 24-25. We asked those who had experience with both the old and new FAFSA, which was easier to complete. What we found was a bit surprising, or maybe unsurprising, based on what families and schools experienced with the better FAFSA. Just 29% found the new FAFSA easier to complete. 33% saw no difference between the old and the new application, and 38% actually found the old application easier to fill out. Now, we'll temper this by saying, based on conversations with many of you and other feedback we've received from students, families, and high school counselors, it really is clear that families had trouble separating the actual act of filling out the form from the financial aid process they experience that's connected with the form. So I think that's one thing that in coming years, we're going to try to really tease out and better understand, because we all know there were significant delays, not only with the opening of the FAFSA, but processing that really had nothing to do with the schools. It had everything to do with the availability and usability of the FAFSA information. So moving forward, we're going to try to tease that out and get a better understanding of whether or not families really thought the actual act of completing the FAFSA was easier. So I mentioned the process, and speaking of it, nearly half of the families who filed the new FAFSA reported that they experienced a delay in receiving their financial aid offer. The delays were more prevalent among four-year public school families, so 54% than four-year private or two-year public school families. 38% of these families reported a delay. What did the delay mean? First and foremost, stress. Without a doubt, the financial aid offer is one of the most critical communications between families and schools, allowing families to truly understand how much college will cost them. With delays in this information and the associated stress, many families started calling their school's financial aid offices to get more information. And I don't need to remind you all about the fact that many schools were understaffed and not really prepared to handle those phone calls, largely because they didn't have any more clarity about what to expect as the families did. And I think that's important to point out. I think everyone was kind of blindsided by this. They weren't aware of what was going on. The Department of Ed, to their own admission, has said, look, we didn't do a great job of communicating. And I think that had a tremendous ripple effect for schools and families alike. The delays also pushed some families to seek out additional funding options, more scholarships, more financial aid searches, and for some, these delays truly made them go back and consider their school choices. Should they be attending a more affordable school? Should they transfer, or should they even take a break? How America Pays for College focuses on our survey, but I did want to briefly give you briefly give you a little bit of an overview of current state. So we've talked about 24, 25. Let's talk a little bit about 25, 26. So first and foremost, the form itself is not undergoing any substantial changes. The Department of Ed would have had to go through a process called negotiated rulemaking in order to change anything on the FAFSA form. They bypassed that this year, largely because in order to do so, there would be two mandatory comment periods along with implementation phases. So this would have put the FAFSA back into a similar timeline as last year, and potentially even worse because they would be implementing changes on to the Department of Ed's own admission, something that wasn't working properly in the first place. In July, College Board CEO Jeremy Singer was brought in as a FAFSA executive advisor. Thereafter, the Department of Ed announced they would be rolling out the FAFSA in a phased approach in an effort to test system enhancements, as well as identify and fix any bugs. So that meant that the first phase, so beta one, as they called it, which actually opened on October 1st, that was starting on October 1st. They will have beta two, beta three, and then again, to quote the Department of Ed, the FAFSA form will be open, quote, on or before December 1st. Now, again, it's early and it's hard to say how this is all going to unfold. And I think we can all appreciate a level of skepticism based on what happened last year. But early indications and early impressions of beta one, at least from a user perspective, has been very positive. Again, I want to temper those expectations just a little bit because we're talking about a very small sample size. We're talking about approximately 650 students that were selected, and they leveraged community-based organizations to roll out that beta one. Beta two will be community-based organizations and high schools. And then finally, beta three, those two plus some college and university partners. So again, rollout is happening. So far, so good. We're very early on. We have a very small sample size. All right, so let's get back to how America pays and let's talk about borrowing for education. So as we hear a lot about America questioning the value of education, we can say that the people who choose this path remain unwavering in how they view a college degree. It's first and foremost an investment in the student's future. 88% of students and parents agree with that statement. These families choose to pursue higher education because they expect this investment to pay off in opportunities and higher earnings. 79% are willing to stretch financially to afford these educational opportunities, and 70% agree that they would rather borrow to attend college than not be able to attend college at all. So to give you an idea of what this has looked like historically, from a percentage standpoint of who strongly or somewhat agrees with the statement, college is an investment in the student's future. So if we start with this year's study, it was 88%. Last year, 88%. In 2022, 88%. 21, 90%. 20, 91%. And then 18 and 19, 90%. So again, it just illustrates that although I know you all probably look at and see the same news outlets I do, we hear a lot about, confidence in higher education is shrinking. Based on our survey, that's not necessarily the case. We have seen, not, not insignificant drops, but it's been relatively nominal. And quite frankly, it's been very steady over the past almost decade. All right. So still on the topic of borrowing. So more than 4 in 10 families who borrowed to help pay for academic year 23-24, so 43%, say they considered attending a more expensive school than they would have otherwise because of access to loans or other types of credit cards. And gang, I'm sorry, I think I may have accidentally skipped a slide here. I sure did. Gotta love this jumpy PowerPoint. So bear with me just a second. We gotta back up, and I gotta tell you about who borrowed. So when we asked families, about 49% of undergraduate families said they borrowed to help cover costs for academic year 23-24. The propensity to borrow varies by school type, as you may expect. So four-year private school families are most likely to borrow, or more likely to borrow than others. So 55% of them said they borrowed compared to 50% of four-year public school families and 36% of two-year public schools. Student borrowing is more common than parent borrowing, but parents who borrow tend to borrow more on average. Students borrow on average about $10,900, and parents borrowed about $13,000. And not to get too deep into the weeds, but a lot of that has to do with the structure of the federal student loan program. So students themselves, they have a hard cap on what they can borrow each academic year based on what their academic standing is, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. Whereas parents, through the federal direct Parent Plus loan, they can borrow up to the remaining gap up to cost of attendance. So it makes a big difference in terms of, and I think that plays in quite a bit in terms of how much is borrowed based on student versus parent. All right, so now we're on the next slide. So we had mentioned more than 4 in 10 families who borrowed to help pay for academic year 23-24 said they considered attending a more expensive school than they would have otherwise because of access to loans or other types of credit. As a result, families who used borrowed funds reported higher levels of college spending compared to families who didn't borrow, even when controlled for school type. So again, makes a fair amount of sense. All right. When we talk about where the money was coming from, federal loans account for the largest share of money borrowed. 44 cents out of every dollar borrowed came from either the federal student loan program, so the federal direct subsidized or unsubsidized loan program, or the Parent Plus loan program. Those are the two types of loans used most often by borrowers and their parents. Private student loans were used by 13% of families and made up 25 cents of every dollar borrowed. Families also relied on other borrowing vehicles such as credit cards, home equity loans, and retirement accounts. Gang, I apologize. My slide deck is jumpy as all get out today. So while 68% of families that relied on borrowed funds said that they've always planned to borrow, fewer aligned on repayment responsibilities and plans for successfully paying back their loans. Regardless of who borrowed, most families expect the students to be involved in paying back education loans. More specifically, 96% of families where the student borrowed and 61% of families where the parent borrowed expect the student to help repay the loans. However, just 40% of borrowing families shared that they discussed who would be responsible for paying back student loans, and 31% discussed who would be responsible for paying back the parent loan. And gang, this is a really big deal, especially when we start talking about the Federal Direct Parent Plus loan. Federal Direct Parent Plus loans are loans that the parent takes out to help pay for the student's education. The parent is the legally responsible party and will be until through the life of the loan. So that, I think that's a common misconception where folks think that they can legally transfer that responsibility to the student. And that's just not the case. And that's why, I think this slide really illustrates how important it is to have those conversations ahead of time. Whose responsibility is it? How are we going to pay for this? And so forth. So as the slide says here, so what? So in academic year 23-24, families were responsible for 71 cents out of every dollar reported for college spending, covering it from income or savings or committing future earnings to pay back money borrowed. Gang, these are the high points as we wrap up today's presentation. With that said, not all families are taking steps to make college more affordable for them. So some of those things that we can do collectively as a higher education community, in our opinions. So helping families be better prepared for another year of FAFSA delays. We already know FAFSA is not going to open up until December 1st, but I also feel like this year has given us a bit of a roadmap. When we start talking about communication plans, when we start talking about staffing, setting and maintaining expectations of students, I think all of those things can help students and families better prepare for the FAFSA, and not to mention the school counselors that we all support. In terms of scholarships, really trying to dispel the common myths will encourage more students to apply. From a personal perspective, I was one of those students. I was a good, not great student, definitely not an athlete, and music just wasn't my thing. So I didn't think any scholarships, frankly, were even within my reach. So I fell into this category, as do a lot of students. And I think collectively, this is something we can all do to, again, help students and families better understand, hey, there are scholarships out there for all different types of students with all different types of interests. And then lastly, repaying student loans responsibly. And this really is encouraging planning family conversations we feel will help families be better prepared when it comes to paying for college. Oftentimes, it's as simple as just having the conversation. I didn't mention it when I jumped on the call initially, but I've been with Sallie Mae for about 5 years. Previous to that, I was on campus for 15 plus years, of which almost the entirety of it was in financial aid. It was really challenging when you would sit down with a family at the time of really registration, or even worse, as the student was there and the student comes to find out they have thousands, if not tens of $1,000 in student loan debt. And too often the response was, well, mom and or dad said, quote, we'll take care of it. And what that tells me is that no one really had that conversation. Folks didn't sit down around the kitchen table and really discuss what this meant financially. Everybody has to be on board. They have to level set expectations. And I often joke that personal finance is one of the last remaining taboos in American society. But in some cases, it's very true. And just being able to have that conversation to talk about who's paying, how are we paying for it, who's responsible for repayment if student loans are involved, and so forth. So very important things that we can all encourage students and families to engage in before enrolling. So folks, that is How America Pays, kind of in a nutshell. If you would like to have more information about the study as a whole, we do have the URL there. So salliemae.com/How America Pays. It's a free study, so it's free to download. We have an infographic that kind of goes over the nuts and bolts of it, but we also have the ability to download the full report as well as the data tables. So if you're like me and you're a data dork and you really want to dig into that, that's available at that URL as well. And at that concludes the formal part of the presentation.
Ed, I'd like to ask you a couple questions if you're willing.
Absolutely.
Before we wrap things up. I guess, my first question is, as we're talking, and please, I want to encourage everyone to use the Q&A to add your questions to that we can share and ask Ed too. But first off, what did you find as like the most surprising findings from How America Pays for College report versus other years? Is there anything you felt like was a huge change across that?
Yeah, I don't know that there were any like seismic changes year over year. We've done this for 17 years, so anymore it just seems like, very small incremental changes. I think, the thing that just continues to surprise me is probably that last point that I made about, we talk about confidence in higher education, we talk about the cost of education, but it routinely surprises me that these conversations aren't happening more and more at home. And I know I joked about it, but it truly is. I know that's a tough conversation for a lot of students and families, but it's so incredibly important. And I guess if we could get one thing out of this report, it's that we could hopefully encourage students and families to have more and more of those conversations so they can make informed decisions and they don't look back and have, what's usually a great experience turn into a not great one because they have debt or more debt than what they anticipated.
Great, thank you. What resources or tools does Sallie Mae offer to assist families in understanding their options for paying for college?
hmm Yeah, great question. So we have a handful of things that we feel like are really, really helpful. The first one is our FAFSA guide. So we have a free and ungated, so no registration required, FAFSA guide that walks students through the FAFSA step by step, but it also goes deeper. So one of the things that we really tapped into was our experience collectively, the team's experience behind that financial aid desk, knowing where students and families oftentimes will get hung up. So we touch on things that sometimes we in higher ed take for granted, like why are they asking this question? Do I need to answer it? And where can I find the answer? They sound so simple and fundamental, but those are oftentimes things that students and families get hung up on. We also have similarly a free and ungated scholarship search tool. So scholarship search by Sallie. So all they do is go in, it sorts and filters. I always jokingly say it's choose your own adventure. So that kind of gives away my age. Uh, but it allows them to not have to register. We absolutely acknowledge and recognize that, hey, you know what? Registration is a barrier for a lot of students. They just don't want to give out their information. We're trying to get as much free money in the hands of students as possible. So we just took down that registration wall. And then we also have all sorts of one pagers, things of that nature. But those are the two really big tools and resources that we're really proud of to help students really find as much free money as they can.
So, what practical advice do you have for families who are feeling overwhelmed by the cost of college and the financial aid process? I mean, obviously you have some tools at Sallie Mae, but
Mhm.
is there anything you recommend? Because I'm honestly, I had a little flashback during as you were talking about things and realizing how little I knew as I was making decisions as a college student in, an era of choose your own adventure. So,
Yes, yeah. So I think really it's about, oh goodness. It's easy to get to your point. It's easy to get overwhelmed. It's easy to get intimidated through this entire process. I think practical advice, start early. And by start early, we know that you can't fill out the FAFSA until December 1st. But start early, do research, have conversations, ask a lot of questions. And I know people always kind of quib that, oh, no question is a silly question. But in the case of financial aid, I think that is 100% accurate. For a lot of folks, this is uncharted territory. And quite frankly, even for our multi-generational families, so much has changed in the 20 plus years, most likely, that they went to college, that they might know the social aspects of applying for college, but the mechanics of paying for college have changed tremendously. So do the research, have the conversations, ask questions. To your point, know what resources are out there. And I think as you go through the process, then it becomes a little less intimidating. You feel a little more familiar with it, and you're willing to, or you're able to get through it a little bit easier.
and I think that's fabulous, fabulous input. Um, Well, Ed, thank you very much for battling through the trials of your internet and still joining us today and providing such a helpful amount of information for our attendees and for Innovate. I know you've been a, a long time Innovate presenter, and we appreciate you being here.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for your patience and understanding. Hey, it's first world problems, but I'm happy to take them. So thanks again, and thank you to everyone who tuned in. Really appreciate it.